Today, one of the most controversial topics in watches, and that is replicas, clones, fakes, whatever you want to call them. We're going to play a game first about whether or not you can pick out which one's fake, and then we're going to follow it up with an analysis as to exactly how you can pick out. The technology required to make a watch is starting to be more widespread, and the advanced techniques and computer mechanics have made replicas wildly close. In each hand you can see a Rolex GMT Master II. This is the Batman or Batgirl. The Batman has the oyster bracelet, the Batgirl has a Jubilee. Not fan of the Batgirl terminology, but either way, one of them is fake and one of them is real. So I'm going to show you them side by side in a few clips, and what I want you to do is try and pick out which one you think is the incorrect or the fake version. First the oyster, then the Jubilee. The oyster, the Jubilee. Now we're going to get a little closer, and here are the lug finishings, again in the same order. The oyster, the Jubilee. Next, let's look at the crowns for the oyster, for the Jubilee. I want a close-up of the dials for the oyster, for the Jubilee. As we get even closer, I want you to take a look at the bracelets as well, the oyster and the Jubilee. Now, which one do you think is the fake? That's the question. And I think if you're in this world and you've been in this world for a while, you're probably going to notice it relatively soon. And the one that really tipped it off for me was the bezel finishing itself. If you look at the reel here, you can see that there's beveling on it. They've basically knocked the edges, they've cleaned it up a bit, whereas on the fake, it looks like a raw CNC cutout portion on the bezel. These are manufactured at a very low price point because they probably make a good amount of money on these fake watches. Now, other than that, from a distance, that's why they call these types of fakes super clone. These are very expensive fake versions of Rolex watches that are meant to deceive almost anyone that wouldn't know what they were looking at. And without a loupe, some of it gets a little challenging. Now, I will say there are a few tells, and we'll get into that a little later. Now, this fake watch, they've gone to the extent where they actually have replicated the movement in the back. Now, technically, the Jubilee never had the 3186 movement inside the back. It was upgraded by the time they moved on to the Jubilee bracelet. So the oyster version had a 3186, but the Jubilee never did. That immediately would be a glaring that's not correct, but let's move with it. This watch does have a jumping hour hand. It does function the same way my 3186 does on my Rolex Explorer 2. That being said, there are a few differences. The first way I could tell when I first handled it was not the general weight, because steel weighs a good amount. You can't figure it out just by that. It's actually when you unwind the crown, you can feel the crown itself wobbles a bit, and that's just a tolerance thing. Now, that being said, you can find that issue on some Rolex watches. That's not immediately obvious. If you use this movement next to the Rolex, you'll find that this is a little bit grittier than the Rolex movement, and that's down to basically just dust and debris and overall finishing of the movement parts. I want to show you real quick detail views of their clone of the 3186. You can see that yes, the parts themselves are correct, but the finishing level is not there at all. The beveling on the sides of these bridges looks like someone just took a knife and started carving at it. The actual screws themselves, for a watchmaker, what they do is they file their screws down so they never gall out or scar the screw heads. But these have been scarred quite a bit. They look pretty ugly. If I saw that amount of scarring on the screws of a vintage watch, I would be very scared as to what kind of issues are going to be inside that movement. The screw head finishing and how good a shape they are is a good indication of how good quality the movement still is in for a vintage watch. The movement itself, yes, is generally replicated, but they also missed one glaring piece, and that's the balance. Now, the balance of most movements is a circle, right? It's the thing that bounces back and forth. It's a pendulum. Rolex, what they do is they put screws on the balance itself, and the screws are basically tightened and loosened. And the further they get away from the center of that disc, the more weight they have on that disc. And so they tighten and loosen these screws on the outside of the balance in order to change how quickly it moves, to change the rate, basically, to get it so that it's close to 0 seconds a day. This does not have any of those screws. It's regulated using a lever. If you were going to open this up and you look at that, you stop the movement, you'd immediately tell that this is not correct. The other thing that stands out as inaccurate and would be a good way to spot is going to be the overall bezel action. So most of these GMT Master II bezels have basically like a rubber feeling bezel that moves side to side. It's a 24 click bezel, and this one's pretty close. I'll give them that. It's scary close, but it's not quite there. It's a little too gritty when you actually move it, whereas the original one, or the correct one, feels a lot smoother. Now, some of the other ways that some people say you can spot one, the date wheel doesn't line up correctly with the Cyclops, like it's offset. The indice thickness is a little different between the two. I can show you different shots of one to the other. And then overall feel. So I feel like the feel portion is what I'm describing. Now, yes, having a real one next to this one is the best way to find out. Obviously, having a watchmaker look at it is another great way to find out, assuming that they know what they're looking at, which I'm assuming most watchmakers do. If a watchmaker opened up this, they would immediately know it was wrong right away. It wouldn't take them more than 2 seconds. They'd see the hairs in it, the dust, the debris, the fingerprint splotches, the lack of a free sprung balance, and they'd know, yep, it's a fake, and moving on. But from the outside, it's a relatively scary, convincing fake. For someone that isn't a nerd about these watches, you may not see the difference. From a listing online, you would probably not see the difference, with the exception in this case of the rehaut is actually offset to the right too much, and the bezel is offset to the right too much. They're just slightly off. The crown doesn't line up on the indice marker, and the bezel is a little off to the right. But if those were correct, and I've seen them correct on other super clones, from a picture online, you wouldn't see the difference. So this is where most people say buy the seller. Pick a reputable person to buy the actual watch from, and then get a watchmaker to check it immediately. If you're gonna buy a very expensive watch, you ought to get it checked as soon as you buy it. If a deal's too good to be true, it's too good to be true. And as it goes for buying a fake in general, I don't recommend it, mainly because this has no feeling. Being someone that has been, crazy enough to buy a couple Rolexes, but there's no good feeling, there's no, I earned this, there's no amplification, which is what I will call most of what I feel when I wear some of the other watches in general that I have in my collection that I enjoy. It tends to amplify a moment. It makes it more enjoyable. I feel luckier, I feel blessed. This doesn't give me that feeling. This feels like I'm wearing a design that I like, but kind of lying at the same time. So those are my thoughts. Do me a favor and subscribe. Stuff like this, I try and get out there. I want to educate as much as possible with some of the nitty gritty about the watch world, as well as some technical stuff. I try to always have a very honest and open opinion. Let me know what you guys think down below. Could you spot it? What are the things you disliked? Have you had any experience or bad stories? Obviously, any of that stuff, be happy to talk about down below. I'll be probably responding to everyone. I'll see you guys in the next one. Take care.